We just wanted to leave the webcam on for just a minute to say hello, but I'm going to turn that off now and just kind of dive into the presentation. So yeah, my name is Karen Napolitano, and I work with the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. We're a nonprofit based here in Denver, but we're a statewide organization. We've been around since 2005 doing anti-human trafficking work specifically. And what you're looking at now is our vision and our mission. Our vision is big, the end of human trafficking, we know. The mission is a little bit more tangible, to inform social change that eliminates human exploitation. So a few things I just want to point out about this mission, about kind of how we do our work. We really believe in that informed piece of social change, that we're using data and research to support our work, and that includes data and research, including survivor-informed information. And so that's a big piece of what we do. We do a ton of research around in different communities around the state, and that's going to come out in some of the data that we show you today. Social change being kind of what we're doing right now. We really look at this issue of human trafficking as the root causes of this issue. We're not kind of a top-down organization. We're more looking at the bottom up. So creating that social change that recognizes the social and systemic inequality that kind of leads to and produces the root causes that create vulnerabilities in our society and push people towards potential exploitation. And then that last piece about human exploitation in general, the fact that it doesn't say human trafficking here is just a recognition that human trafficking is kind of on a continuum of exploitation, where people are kind of weaving in and out of experiences, and human trafficking is on kind of one end of that continuum, being pretty extreme form of exploitation. And so these are our main programming areas. Training and education is a big piece of what we do. Since we started in 2005, we've trained about 32,000 professionals. That's mostly law enforcement, healthcare providers, and child welfare workers. So pretty relevant to what you guys do. We're going to talk about why that particular group, why child welfare workers and those working with what we would call at-risk youth in a little bit. But that's pretty much what we're doing here today, informing that social change through training and education. Research and action is what I mentioned earlier. We're going out into communities, and we're really identifying what and how human trafficking presents in different communities across Colorado. So trafficking is going to look really different in, let's say, Alamosa than it's going to look in Fort Collins or Denver, or how it's going to look in Eagle County up in the ski resort towns is going to look very different from Grand Junction, or maybe down in the San Luis Valley. So the vulnerabilities that exist in each of these communities is going to be really different, and the response, the kinds of resources that are available for potential victims or for prevention efforts. We run the hotline, which has an affiliated resource directory. So there's a 24/7 human trafficking hotline. If you didn't know, I'm glad that you do now. We're going to talk a little bit more about how that can be a resource for you in a little bit. And then we have a leadership development program, which is not only for kind of traditional interns, but also for people with lived experiences. So we've got a survivor leadership development group as well. So today we're gonna walk through trafficking definitions and vulnerabilities, but what we're really gonna focus on there are those vulnerabilities. I want everybody on the webinar today to be able to understand what they're seeing, right? A lot of people, especially in your fields, are interacting with victims or survivors of human trafficking and really don't know it. And so I want you to see what those vulnerabilities look like. We're going to talk through different scenarios and examples of trafficking cases that we've seen here in Colorado, to understand those vulnerabilities, what pushes people into these kind of risky situations where someone could potentially step in and exploit them. We're going to talk through those Colorado for specific examples. We're going to talk about trauma and a trauma-informed response. We're going to provide some resources to you, and probably the biggest one there are my hotline and the hotline that Yolanda runs, and we'll talk about that at the end. And she's going to go over mandatory reporting requirements and what that looks like from the Colorado Department of Human Services side. So I love that over 60% of you have had a human trafficking training before. That's very rare. So generally when I ask that question, really only about 10% of the room raises their hands. And so unfortunately I can't put you on the spot, but normally what I would ask my audience is kind of what pictures or images come to mind when you hear the term human trafficking. So I just want you to be thinking about that as I'm talking through these definitions. What images come to mind? What populations? What does that person that you're picturing look like? What gender are they? How old are they? I want you to be thinking about that, because while this training is going to mostly focus on youth and young adults and mostly focus on how we see it presenting here in Colorado, I want you to be aware that human trafficking happens to everyone, right? So if you serve adults or children, if you serve people who identify as male or female or any gender, you are serving potential victims of trafficking. And we've seen all different kind of walks of life represented in the survivor population here in Colorado. So this next slide here is kind of the simplest definition of human trafficking that I can give you. If I gave you the lengthy legal definition, it would take up a couple of screens. So this is the definition that you can kind of take back with you. It's a severe form of exploitation for labor, which includes sex as a form of labor through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. So this is the international definition. The term human trafficking was defined for the very first time in the year 2000 at an international level at the Palermo Protocol of the UN. Before that, it existed, of course. Before that, we didn't call it human trafficking, though, right? We called it kidnapping or sexual assault or some kind of wage violation or labor violation. We actually named it and made it its own crime of human trafficking in the year 2000. So what that means is this is a very old crime, right? Modern slavery has been around since the beginning of human existence and always has been. But what we have is this new definition and therefore a really, really new response to this very, very old crime. And so be thinking about that as well. I mean, what that means is that most law enforcement have not been trained. Most child welfare workers have not been trained, though we're working on it. Most healthcare providers have not been trained on human trafficking. And so that's a little bit why I was surprised by the response of 60% or more, but very impressed. I mean, that means we're making headway, and that's really, really great news. So be thinking back to your previous trainings, not only in human trafficking, but also domestic violence or interpersonal violence or child abuse trainings. Those are all going to be pretty relevant here as we talk through this. So going back to this definition, that international definition included sex as a form of labor, and then included these three important words here: force, fraud, or coercion. So there has to be some element of force, fraud, or coercion present for it to be trafficking. If we're not looking at force, fraud, or coercion, then we're probably looking at some other and maybe related crime. But those three words are pretty important for it to be trafficking. In the same year that we passed the Palermo Protocol with the UN, it's the same year that we defined human trafficking as its own crime internationally, we defined it in the US as well. So in the year 2000, we wrote the TVPA, that's the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and we parsed out the definition. So instead of including sex as a form of labor as they did in the international definition, in this definition, we said, our United States definition, we said, actually, there are these three categories, and they're different and have different kind of burdens of proof. And we decided, and you can see between 1 and 2 the difference here. Those under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex, and those 18 and over involved in commercial sex through force, fraud, or coercion. There's a pretty easy to spot distinction, right? I just got through telling you force, fraud, or coercion are necessary for it to be trafficking. In the US, we made an exception. We said those under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex acts do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion because they don't have the cognitive ability to consent to commercial sex. Okay, so what that means in practice is anyone under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex is by definition a victim or survivor of human trafficking. Okay, so there's no such thing as a teen prostitute, no such thing as a child prostitute. That's what we decided on a federal level. A couple of important other distinctions to make here is that commercial component. there has to be something of value traded for the sex act. It doesn't necessarily have to be cash. It can be drugs, it can be a ride, it can be a place to stay, it can be a meal or a bus ticket. So trading anything of value in exchange for a sex act is considered commercial sex. And also, sex act isn't necessarily only selling sex. It's not only prostitution. It can be any sex act. So that could be pornography or stripping, any sex act. Another important distinction to make here is how that feels, how this definition feels for someone under the age of 18 or someone who turns 18 the next day, right? So someone who's 17 years, 362 days old, and then 5 days later, you know, they're 18. Suddenly the burden of proof is on them to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to prove that they were trafficked, and instead of willingly selling commercial sex, which would be a crime. And so I want you to be thinking about how difficult that might be. We are going to talk through the definitions of force, fraud, or coercion in just a minute, but I want you to be thinking about how difficult it might be to prove coercion, for example, right? Like, how do you prove that someone threatened to hurt your family? Prove it, right? It can be very challenging. And so that plays into why we have so few people coming forward to report this crime, and why we have so few cases that have gone through the criminal justice system, because it's really hard to prove. So often, instead of enforcing that human trafficking law that we have in Colorado, law enforcement, DAs, and judges are kind of forced or led down a path of charging for other crimes that are related but aren't actually trafficking because they're easier to prove. Another important distinction to make here is that this is the federal law, and each state has its own human trafficking law as well. So I didn't put the definitions up here for the Colorado laws, but we passed our first legislation in Colorado in 2006. But what our law enforcement partners have told us about that law is that it wasn't very strong. It didn't have strong language. It didn't have any mandated funding or training. And so we had very few, in fact, only 3 cases brought forward between 2006 and when we passed much stronger legislation in 2014. So a lot of the human trafficking movement, as we see it today, started taking place up in the shaping of that new legislation that was passed in 2014, so from 2012 on. And so really, again, it's another thing to point out that this is really just a nascent movement here in Colorado. We're really just getting started, kind of at the tip of the iceberg of the work that we have to do here. Very recently, when I say very recently, literally days ago, our governor just signed into law some new legislation that kind of brings Colorado's legislation up to par with this federal legislation. Until literally just a few days ago, it was legal in Colorado to arrest someone who was under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex. And it was happening, not very frequently, but it has happened in Colorado over the last few years since we passed this legislation. So we just passed some legislation here in Colorado that makes it mandatory for those under the age of 18 involved in commercial sex to be treated as survivors of a crime, which is great news. The last category of trafficking here in the US and these federal legislation is labor trafficking. And we didn't parse out that definition into 18 and over and 18 and under. So anyone involved in labor trafficking does have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And you'll just see a little note at the bottom here that it's not limited to those who are foreign-born adults or females. It's a little shout out to the myths and misconceptions. And you do have a handout on those included in this presentation over to the right side of your screen. We know that this is not limited to those who are foreign-born. So yes, we've had a large number of individuals from other countries that have been trafficked in Colorado. We've had representatives from 42 different countries identified as survivors of human trafficking here in Colorado. But we also know that in the victim population that our partners are serving, that we're seeing it's about 50-50, about 50% foreign national, about 50% domestic here in Colorado. But those are just the victims or survivors that have been identified, that have either come forward and been identified or have been intercepted by law enforcement or our service providers, which again is really just the tip of the iceberg since so few people do report. We know it's not just adults, we know it's not just youth. The youngest person identified in Colorado was under the age of 1, that person was being sold for sex. They were intercepted, so they were not victimized. However, that was the intent. And the oldest person identified in Colorado was 71. So it really spans all ages. And it's certainly not just females. We've got all genders represented in both sex and labor trafficking. I want to stress that we see males and LGBTQ involved in sex trafficking, as well as females. It's a little bit of a myth, again, that it's only a female crime. And we know that the LGBTQ population is overrepresented in the survivor population as well. So just some considerations for minors, since that's what we're focusing on a little bit today. That, as I mentioned, force, fraud, or coercion does not have to be proven if it is sex trafficking specifically. A minor cannot consent to commercial sex, even if they say that they did. Legally, they cannot. Thinking that a minor was an adult is not a defense for someone who solicits sex from a minor. And that labor trafficking piece, they do need to prove force, fraud, or coercion in order to prove that there was labor trafficking. So this definition here is the action means purpose model. This is like another way to think through this definition. So in your own work, if you're working with a client, or maybe you're thinking back to a time when you worked with a client and wondering if they had experienced exploitation, this is a way to think back through that experience and define it as yes or no, this was human trafficking. So something from each one of these categories has to be present for it to be trafficking. So there has to be an action. And that's recruited. Someone could be recruited out of a group home, which is very frequent, out of a hospital, out of a school, out of a foster placement. Someone is harbored, and that is held somewhere against their will, not allowed to leave, right? Someone may be transported, and that's transported across international borders, transported across town, or someone might not be transported at all. Someone could be trafficked out of their own home in Aurora and never leave their home. So transportation is one of several actions, but is not necessary for it to be trafficking. Someone could be provided. We see an increasing amount of parents providing their children to a predator in exchange for money to support a growing drug abuse, substance abuse problem. So we see, in conjunction with the opioid crisis, an increase of individuals being recruited out of drug rehabilitation centers, and also an increase of parents who are experiencing substance abuse, selling their children for sex. And then there's that obtained piece, and that is someone could be kind of snatched off the street, obtained in that way. I do want to do a little myth busting here that is not very common. So much more frequently, significantly more than 50% of the time, a survivor or a trafficking victim knows their trafficker. So it's really kind of a movie myth, that movie Taken, for example, where someone is kind of snatched off the street and thrown into a van and taken off somewhere. What we see much more frequently is someone either has an existing relationship with their trafficker, or they're being groomed by their trafficker, who may be their employer, maybe a loved one, maybe someone from the neighborhood. So it's usually not that obtained action, though it can be and probably has been. Means is through force, fraud, and coercion, but you see the stars there, and that's to reinforce that piece about how youth involved in commercial sex do not have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And the purpose is for commercial sex acts or labor or services. So let's talk a little bit through force, fraud, and coercion. Force is pretty easy to picture, right? Force is physical assault or sexual assault, physical confinement or isolation, being locked up somewhere. Certainly those methods are used, but again, as I mentioned in this previous slide, often someone is kind of groomed or kind of walked into this experience. It's not so dramatic as kind of thrown into a basement and locked away. So what we see used more frequently are physical or psychological coercion or fraud used at the beginning of the relationship, and then force comes into the relationship a little bit later, maybe after they put up some resistance or try to escape. So physical coercion, psychological coercion, threats to life or the safety of the victim, threats to family members, threats of deportation, or fraud, false promises, we'll give you a job doing X, Y, Z, and when you get there, it's not what you were promised, or the living conditions aren't what you were promised, the wages are withheld to pay off a debt that you didn't know you would have, that kind of thing. And then when someone tries to leave that situation, then force might be brought in. So these are some examples of questions that you could, again, be asking yourself, not questions you necessarily be asking a client or a survivor, but something you might be asking yourself if you're trying to make an identification. Is a person being forced to stay where they work? This picture on this slide is a picture of individuals that were being forced to live at the construction site where they worked. That is very common. We see it on farms, we see it in brothels, we see it in agriculture, in construction, in restaurants. Fraud is, as I mentioned, being promised something and given something else. So, where they promised a job modeling, and when they get there, in fact, they are stripping, or where they promised a job selling cleaning products, maybe, and when they get there, they have a large debt to pay off, and they're not actually making any profit from the products that they're selling. Coercion is something we see in just about every relationship involved in trafficking. So I want you to look at this picture on this slide, this part-time job. I took this picture literally.
Just really quickly, sorry to interrupt. It looks like there is a little bit of a delay in the PowerPoint. So we're currently not seeing that image that you're talking about.
Oh, no. Okay.
There we go. We see it now. So just as an FYI, there's just a slight bit of a delay on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you for letting me know. Sorry about that. So this picture here, this part-time job picture that you're seeing, I took this 1 block away from my office here in the north part of Denver. We see these all over the city. This is well, I'll read it to you. Part-time job, $10 to $40 per hour, no transportation, no problem. Must be 14 years or older, older adults welcome, nightly bonuses, weekly paychecks, team environment, call today, start tomorrow. So let's talk about who this kind of advertisement is going to appeal to. We see this kind of relationship pretty often with youth. So let's say there is a runaway youth from another state outside of Colorado. Let's say that youth is 13 years old and they're from Kansas, just for an example. And they've experienced a lot of domestic violence in the house. They've seen a lot of violence in the relationship that they grew up with. And let's even say maybe that they identify as LGBTQ. And so they're pushed out of their home through the violence, and maybe they've run quite a bit. And they think, 13 years old, the next state over, Colorado, has legal marijuana, and I'm going to go to Colorado and work in the marijuana industry. It's going to be great, right? Everyone's heard good things about Colorado. So they hop on a train or they hitch down I-70. And they get to Denver. And when they get to Denver, they realize, or they quickly find out, that they can't get a job in the marijuana industry because they're only 13. And they find themselves on the 16th Street Mall, living without a home, experiencing homelessness, and probably creating a community among other homeless youth in that area. They're trying to figure out how they're going to survive. They don't have a place to go back to, and they don't have any money to go back to in any way. And they see a sign like this, right? No transportation, must be 14 years or older. They think, perfect, this is the job for me, right? They make that phone call to one of those numbers. And what this usually is either a magazine sales crew or a cleaning supply sales crew. These are often exploitative, not always, but very frequently. And they might not always be trafficking, but they are frequently exploitative. So what these people will do is they'll pick up that youth. So we said they were on the 16th Street Mall, and they've created a street community there of other youth experiencing homelessness. They're usually taken outside of their community. So if they're hanging out in Denver, they're going to be taken to Grand Junction or to Colorado Springs or maybe even to Wyoming. So they're taken outside of their community. They are trained and they're transported and they're fed and kept in a hotel during that time, accruing a debt. Usually they didn't know they were accruing a debt, and it's a couple weeks later when they're told they have this debt that they have to pay off now. They're given an unreasonable quota that they can't meet, And the debt continues to increase as they're traveling around the country, selling magazines or cleaning equipment, and they're really not able to get out of what we call debt bondage. So that's a form of trafficking, and it's a way that we see debt bondage play out in Colorado pretty frequently, especially with youth. So not having control over their own identity documents, threatening to report someone to the authorities or harm a family member, these things are also very common within coercion. The other way we see debt bondage play out here in Colorado is when a smuggling situation can turn into a trafficking situation. So another one of those myths that we're hearing pretty frequently in the news is that smuggling and trafficking are interchangeable. We hear them used interchangeably pretty frequently in the media. And that is a mistake. They are very distinct crimes. So smuggling is a crime against a border. When you pay someone to smuggle you, let's say across the border with Mexico, you are paying a coyote or someone to take you across. Once you get smuggled across into the country illegally, you've been smuggled, and that situation is then over. You pay the person the money, and you're now in the United States illegally, and that's the end of that situation. That situation can turn into a trafficking situation if, let's say, that smuggler says, you know, actually that took an extra week and I had to hide you for that extra week and feed you, and now you owe me another $1,000. And the person says, well, I don't have $1,000 to pay that off. Well, and the smuggler might say, okay, well, come with me, I'll take you to Colorado, I know a place where you can work it off, right? And they're brought to a farm or a ranch or a construction site, a meat packing plant, a dairy farm, a restaurant here in downtown Denver, and they're forced to usually live where they're working, again, accruing more debt, and they're really not able to get out of this cycle of debt bondage. And then layered onto that is the experience of being in the country illegally. So generally, the person who smuggled them in knows where they're from, knows where their family is, somewhere in Central America, has threatened to hurt their family if they leave that situation, has also threatened to deport them, right? Knows they're in the country illegally, and probably has control over their identity documents as well. So there's this added layer of coercion on top of the already vulnerability of not having any money, being in a country that you're not familiar with, probably not speaking the language, not knowing your rights, right? So these are the ways we see debt bondage play out here in Colorado pretty frequently. So I mentioned at the beginning, we were going to talk through some vulnerabilities. So I want to talk through some push and pull factors that can lead people to be vulnerable, and someone potentially stepping in and exploiting that vulnerability. But what I want to stress here is that individuals, and especially youth, who end up in these situations, they're not deviant, right? They're not bad kids. They're not stupid. They're humans. They're humans with very human responses, and human needs, right? And so if someone has, let's say, a history of abuse, we've got these push factors on the left side and the pull factors on the right. Someone's experienced that history of abuse, let's say that same 13 or 14-year-old kid that I mentioned earlier from Kansas, and all the loving relationships that they've seen in their past have included violence. They kind of have a skewed version of what a healthy relationship might look like. And really what they're looking for is a relationship because they don't have it with their family or the person that raised them. And so if someone's got that history of abuse and that kind of skewed version of what a healthy relationship should look like, and someone spots that and kind of leans in and offers them a relationship, right? I love you. I want to be with you. I want to marry you. I'll take care of you. I can be like your mother. I can be like your father. I'll be your mentor. I'll show you the ropes, right? These kind of relationships are exactly what that youth is looking for. And it's very human to lean in and start listening if you're not really familiar with what a healthy relationship should look like, right? If someone's run away or they're experiencing homelessness, they've got incredible needs that need to be filled, right? It's cold in Colorado. Just a couple of months we had, remember the bomb cyclone? Think about individuals who are experiencing homelessness on that day, right? We don't have enough beds here in Colorado. We definitely don't have enough beds for the homeless population here in Denver. And bomb cyclone is approaching, right? And someone's living on the street. And someone offers them a home, even if it's just for the night. Someone offers them a place to stay. If their choice is between spending the night on the street during bomb cyclone, or maybe getting in the car with someone who you might even know you might have to do something with that you don't want to do, you still might get in that car, right? Because almost anything is better than being on the street for the bomb cyclone. But even in a more long-term way, if someone offers a family and a home, right, there's this person, they live down in Aurora, they take care of us, they let us all stay in the house, all we got to do is a little work for them, right? Family and home, that sounds good, right? That sounds pretty great to someone who's experiencing homelessness here in Colorado. Or if someone's experiencing economic vulnerability, let's say it's that 13-year-old kid who can't get a job because they're 13, but it could also be someone who's undocumented and can't get a job for that reason. It could be someone who's got a felony charge and can't get hired because of that charge. And someone offers income, right? We all need income. They might need to feed their family or feed themselves. They might be, you know, we're smack dab in the middle of a housing crisis here in Colorado, and they might be right on the verge of losing their home. And someone offers them a source of income. Maybe it's under the table. Maybe it even seems a little bit sketchy. They might still be willing to take that chance in order to not become homeless or get some food on the table for their kids, right? You can see how someone might end up in a vulnerable position. And of course, not everyone working under the table is being trafficked, but you could see where a trafficker could take advantage of that vulnerability. And someone who's got a marginalized identity, let's say a transgender youth in a community, a conservative community that just doesn't accept that identity. Or let's say a young Muslim immigrant from Somalia who lives in a community without other Somalis, who can't find anyone who speaks her language, single parent household, and the parent is working full-time constantly to support them. They're socially isolated, right? Either of these youth might be hanging out by themselves a lot, maybe on the street, maybe in a mall, youth center. And someone steps up and notices that, because that's what they're looking for, right? A trafficker's looking for that kind of vulnerability that they can prey on, and offers them that acceptance, right? Maybe they speak that language that that youth speaks and hasn't been able to speak for months. Or maybe they say, you know, I love you exactly the way you are, right? Transgender or with hijab, right? I love you exactly the way you are, and I accept you for exactly who you are. And that might be the first time that that marginalized kid has ever heard something like that, right? And you bet they're leaning in. You bet they're gonna start listening and maybe start a relationship with that person, right? So I show this slide deck to, yes, talk through some examples of what we're seeing, but also just to kind of acknowledge that we, all of us as a society, myself included, really need to be doing a better job of offering those things there on the right side of the screen, a relationship, a family, and a home, right? Than the trafficker is, right? Because right now the traffickers are winning. The traffickers are offering these things to individuals who can't find them elsewhere in our society. And that's the pull, right? That's the pull. So I need to be offering someone a job even though they've made a mistake in their past. I accept you just the way you are. It's really important that we kind of all acknowledge that. So a little bit of shifting here, and I realize maybe you're not quite seeing this next slide, so I'll talk through it slowly for letting it catch up. But this slide is talking about the factors that contribute to human trafficking here in Colorado. So some of the industries that kind of lend themselves to potential exploitation, as well as some of the kind of geographical touch points here in Colorado that can lead to exploitation. So industries like agriculture, ranching, the hospitality industry, tourism, construction, all of those industries are very high on the types of industries that we have here in Colorado, as well as high on potential exploitation. So they've got high immigrant populations, high turnover, low wage. They're often in remote parts of the state, often not always. But you can see how these kinds of things can lend themselves to maybe someone not coming forward to report. So let's say someone's on a temporary work visa legally, an H-2A or a J-1 work visa. Those visas in the US are tied to one employer. So if someone is tied to their employer by their visa, if they report violence or they report some kind of exploitation or really any problem with that employment situation, they can actually lose their status and be deported. Makes it much less likely that someone would come forward. We've got a huge tourism industry here in Colorado. So be thinking about, you know, who's washing your sheets when you're standing up at a ski resort town. We've had examples of people renting out Airbnbs to pimp out young girls to tourists. Presumably the tourists, didn't know they were buying sex from someone who's under the age of 18. They were sex buyers, not necessarily traffickers. However, they were still buying sex from a minor, contributing to the trafficking situation. We've got transfer points from east to west. So we've got I-70 running clear across the country. We've got I-25 running clear across the country right through Colorado. And these are known trafficking highways for both drugs and humans. We've got Denver International Airport. So it's the only international airport within a 600-mile radius where the overwhelming majority of immigrants are coming through. We've got a huge commercial sex industry here in Colorado. That's partially due to the influx of tourism. We've got huge immigration influxes and generally just massive influxes of humans into Colorado. About 1 million people have moved here in the last 10 years, about 450,000 of them to the Denver area. So that's a lot of humans, and where there's an increase in demand for both sex and labor, there's an increase in demand for potentially exploited sex and labor. And so, you can look outside your window anywhere any day in Colorado and see a new construction site, right? So in our research, we've identified severe exploitation, trafficking in these different settings. So these aren't kind of potential locations where trafficking could occur, but actual locations or industries where trafficking has occurred here in Colorado. So I've already gone through a lot of those. We see a lot of domestic servitude here inside the city. What I want to talk about here is the forced drug muling. There's been an uptick in forced drug dealing and drug muling of youth here in Colorado. So what we're seeing is youth from Central America being forced through threats of violence to themselves and to their families, sometimes gang-related, to forcing them to mule drugs across the border from Mexico. Once they get across the border, they may be picked up by someone in the gang and brought to Denver, and then forced to sell drugs on the street here in Denver. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're left right at the border and picked up by ICE and then put into deportation proceedings. So we've seen an increase. We've had service providers tell us about this increase as well as law enforcement. But it's really hard to prove, right? Some 14-year-old kid picked up selling drugs on the street in Denver looks like a drug dealer, right? You've got to ask a lot of the right questions to identify that youth as a victim of human trafficking. And until we've got all of our law enforcement and child welfare workers trained to recognize that as a potential form of trafficking, we're going to keep missing it. But I will say we are getting a little bit better at it. We see forced panhandling of youth on the street, forced advertising. So when you see people giving out flyers on the street, sometimes that's a form of forced labor. And with youth especially, we see an intersection of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Often they're experiencing both. So maybe they're being forced to sell magazines, and they're also experiencing sexual exploitation at night after they've gotten back from their day of selling magazines. So just kind of something else to be thinking about. This one case here, the Sean Crumpler case. In 2015, when Sean Crumpler was identified, he was a 50-year-old white male who lived in the house that you may see pictured here, or else will in just a minute. It's a really nice house. It's a house that was in Aurora, or that is in Aurora. And this gentleman was exploiting young boys for many, many years. So he would identify street youth, mostly LGBTQ identified males, and he would offer them family, home, drugs, protection in exchange for sex. It went on for several years, and many, many boys and young men were victimized at that house. The way that he was identified was a tip. When they knocked down his door, there were 12 naked boys found in the house. He will be in jail for the rest of his life. But I tell this story because I really want people to understand that this isn't just, sexual exploitation is not just something that happens to girls. It's happening to boys. There are lots of reasons why we don't identify boys in this population very frequently. It's mostly because of our kind of societal stereotypes and because of some of the images that you either are seeing now or will see in just a minute on this ideal victim slide. So I want you to be thinking back to some of the images that I said to be thinking about at the very, very beginning of this presentation. It's likely that what came to mind was someone that looked like somebody in one of these pictures, right? It's what we call the ideal victim. And so I'm pointing this out not because these individuals or individuals who look like this aren't victimized, because certainly they are, but it's a really big part of the problem if we're only identifying those types of victims that fit into our ideal victim profile, that we're really missing the bigger picture. So I hope you can see this slide that says who's missing. Because what we're really seeing are people of color, we're seeing the LGBTQ population overrepresented, we're seeing male population, we're seeing adults, right? It's not always kind of the young female domestic victim. And I really want to emphasize that. Because if we're not spotting it, and society kind of doesn't identify that population as a potential victim, then we're either missing it in our own work. We're also putting up barriers for individuals who are victims to come forward, because they're not going to see themselves as victims either. And they're going to assume that there aren't resources out there to support them. And in reality, there are significantly fewer. The overwhelming majority of our resources are directed at domestic minor sex trafficking victims who identify as female. So we really need to be doing a better job again at providing resources for survivors who don't fit into that ideal victim category. What you're seeing on this next slide, or what you will see very soon, is the number of state judicial cases and filings of human trafficking statutes since 2014. So I mentioned that we passed much stronger legislation in 2014. There were only 3 cases before 2014. And as you can see, there's 129 cases since. So that's a big jump. I mean, that's pretty great. We're really happy with this legislation. That doesn't mean there isn't room to improve it, as we found out just a few days ago, and we passed some legislation just the other day. But we are getting better at prosecuting these cases. But what I want to point out here are some of the discrepancy in the numbers. So the very first column, no, sorry, the very first row is involuntary servitude, which is labor trafficking. The next row is sexual servitude of an adult, and then sexual servitude of a minor. So obviously you see the sexual servitude of a minor has much higher numbers than any other category. And that's because it's kind of the low-hanging fruit, right? We don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And that's the population that people in general in society feel the most sympathy for. So there's more funding going towards identifying those cases, and that's good, right? We don't want to take away funding from identifying cases of sexual servitude of a minor, but we do want to recognize that there are other victims out there. It would appear from these numbers that there are very few labor trafficking cases, but in fact, what we're hearing from victim service providers is that they're seeing significantly more cases of labor trafficking. However, since they're so hard to prove, they're often not brought through the criminal justice system. Victims are seeking services and sometimes even seeking recourse, meaning dollars, through the civil justice system, so suing for civil crimes and retribution for that. But often not through the criminal justice system, since it is such a high bar for proving that coercion. 78% of those cases were filed in the Denver metro area. So we know 16 of the 22 districts here in judicial districts here in Colorado did have a case. So there are cases all over the state, but they're concentrated in Denver, and that's not a big surprise. That's where half of the population of the state lives. But we do know that they're happening all over the state. We know that Rocky Mountain and Innocence Lost Task Force, that's that second bullet point there on this slide underneath the table. Rocky Mountain Innocence Lost Task Force is a task force here in Denver that specifically works with domestic minor sex trafficking cases, so that specific form of trafficking. And in 2017, they identified 112 victims. 88 of them were female, 21 were male, sorry about that, and 3 were transgender. So we've got several cases of domestic minor sex trafficking still pending under that legislation. And then I mentioned earlier that we run the human trafficking hotline. So in 2017, we had 423 calls to the hotline. In 2018, we had 608. And you can see in both cases about a third of them were from survivors. So we had almost a 40% increase in calls from 2017 to 2018, and that's consistent with previous years, 2015 to 2016, 2016 to 2017, and so on. We've had a real increase in calls. Now, all of these increases in numbers, I want to make clear that we don't expect that that's because trafficking has increased so dramatically here in Colorado, but because awareness of it has, because people like you are getting trained, because law enforcement is getting trained, and because awareness is going out to vulnerable populations all over the state. So we're seeing an increase in cases, but we don't want you to think that that means that there's an increase necessarily in trafficking or traffickers. I also want to point out here, in addition to it just being such a difficult crime to prove, these numbers don't accurately represent the victim population because so many victims, either one, don't identify as victims, they identify as having a crappy employer, or being exploited by their parent or guardian or family member. But people don't generally kind of walk into your office if you're a service provider and say something like, "Help me, I'm a human trafficking victim," right? It's just not an identity that people identify with. It's not a language people are using yet, especially vulnerable populations. So people aren't kind of coming forward to report these cases. Often they're terrified of their trafficker as an employer or as a pimp. Often they really just want victim services and don't want to pursue justice through the criminal justice system at all. Maybe there's a lack of trust of law enforcement for various reasons. And so they're not necessarily coming forward. So these numbers that we're seeing on the slide are important. They represent what we have seen, but they're really, again, just the tip of the iceberg. So I want to kind of quickly just talk through a little bit of trauma. It would, be a whole other presentation to talk through all the different ways that people experience trauma in a trafficking situation. But briefly, I want to talk through how the trauma experienced during trafficking can be a little bit different and potentially more severe than trauma experienced by a single event, right? So we call this polyvictimization. We've got the effect of past traumas of somebody's individual experience. So they've got an increase in vulnerability because of the past traumas, like domestic violence that they've experienced at home, whatever kind of those push factors that I talked about earlier that got them into this kind of messed up situation, right? And then there's trauma in each one of the stages of a trafficking situation. So there's trauma in recruitment. So imagine you've already experienced the past traumas, you've got an increase in vulnerabilities and intensified consequences, and you've met someone who you've created a relationship with, be it a romantic relationship or a mentoring or parental type relationship. And at some point during that early stages of that relationship, it shifts and you realize you've been recruited. Maybe you don't use the terminology recruited, but you realize this isn't what you thought it was, right? This person doesn't actually love me, or whatever. And there's trauma in that experience. There's trauma in realizing you've been recruited. And then imagine how it would feel during the transit. So you realize you've been recruited and you're being transported somewhere now. Imagine how traumatic it would be to be being transported from your home where you were safe now to a motel or out of state lines, away from your family and away from your community. Or there could be a lack of transit. Imagine how traumatizing it would be to not be allowed to leave somewhere, being locked in. And then there's trauma in a destination, right? You arrive at the destination and now you're being initiated. And that initiation might look like days without sleep, food, or water. It could look like multiple sexual assaults. It could look like 18-hour days working without food or water under threats of violence, right? So there's trauma in that initiation phase. And then there's trauma in the indoctrination. And that's that we hear fight, or flee, fight, flight, or flee, freeze, I'm saying it wrong, sorry, fight, flight, or freeze. And that's that freeze part, right? Indoctrination is when you accept, you tried to escape multiple times and you've received multiple beatings and there's been threats of violence made against your family and you just accept what's happening to you. This is my life, I can't escape it, I better just accept it. And there's trauma in that indoctrination as well. So we see trauma experienced at multiple stages of this experience for folks. And these are the different ways that someone might respond. Right? So we've got common survivor reactions like Stockholm syndrome, very similar to what you see in child abuse or interpersonal violence. They may not show any emotional reactions at all. They may not want to cooperate with the investigation or prosecution because what if their trafficker is their family member or someone that they love? They may refuse services or assistance. They may be terrified of you, right? Regardless of how unpresuming or not terrifying you think you look, right? We're all in helping professions because we want to help. But if someone's experienced trauma and they've been groomed not to trust systems, or they don't trust systems because the systems have failed them in the past, then there's a good chance that they're not going to trust you either, at least not right away. So you get irritable and uncooperative. You get people who refuse service, people who don't identify as victims. It's super important that we recognize that not everyone is going to walk in asking for your help, and they may not even want it when it's offered, right? Super, super important to recognize that. I'm sure most people have heard about the ACE study. These are just some of the vulnerabilities that youth have. And of course, youth grow up to become adults, right? So the Adverse Childhood Experience Study basically recognized that those children and youth who then become adults who've experienced multiple youth traumas have a significantly increased likelihood of experiencing a whole range of disease, disabilities, and social problems. So you can see through this pyramid that once they, from the bottom up, once they've experienced adverse childhood experiences, we get disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, adoption of health risk behaviors, which eventually can result in early death. What the ACE study found, and these are the 10 ACEs, different types of abuse, household challenges, and neglect. What the ACE study found was that those youth who had experienced 4 or more ACEs were at a significantly higher rate of experiencing some of those other sequelae that I just mentioned. This is a list of some of them. These are the ones that are kind of most related to trafficking. So alcoholism, depression, sexually transmitted diseases, risk for intimate partner violence. So those who've experienced 4 or more ACEs are at significant increased risk for experiencing some of these sequelae. There's actually significantly more. These are just some of them. And then there have been a couple of studies that have linked trafficking and ACEs. So this study looked at youth in the juvenile justice system in Florida, 64,000 of them. The gray line represents those youth who were in the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, but who had not been trafficked. And the black line is those who'd been trafficked. And you can see these numbers are pretty staggering. We see 60% of those youth who'd been trafficked had experienced physical or sexual abuse, 50% had experienced emotional abuse. Some of them are pretty high for the those that were in the juvenile justice system as well. But take a look at this next one. This next graph is showing the number of ACEs, right? So the gray line is showing the average number of ACEs that those in the juvenile justice system have experienced. And the black line is showing the average number of ACEs that those who've been trafficked experienced. So you can see this number is 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Like imagine what the household looks like for a youth who has had 10 ACEs, right? And the likelihood that they may be trafficked. Just something to be thinking about in your work when someone's presenting with kind of, you know, in trauma, you know, what they may be experiencing at home. One quick study I just want to talk through, it was this homeless youth study. It was looking at youth ages 17 to 25 who were seeking resources. So they had some touch point with the resources in their community in Philadelphia, Phoenix, or Washington. And they were asked a series of questions. And what they found were that 1 in 5 were victims of human trafficking. 25% reported being approached or paid for sex on their first night of being homeless. 7% had not graduated high school. 95% of the sex trafficking victims had a history of child maltreatment. And 41% had at least one out-of-home placement. So I think that's super relevant for you all who are working within the child welfare system. But I'm not blaming you by any means. I work very closely with child welfare, and Yolanda can attest to that when she comes to talk to you in just a minute. But what we know is that those in the child welfare system can be at increased vulnerability, right? They're used to being moved around by adults, having little say in where they're living. They're used to people being paid to take care of them. they've experienced some kind of abuse and neglect. That's how they ended up in the child welfare system in the first place, right? So we've got this increase in percentages of youth who've been in the child welfare system at some point who are eventually trafficked. So I'm just gonna pause there for a minute and have Yolanda come on in just a second. I hope you guys are writing some questions in the box. Hold on one moment. So I didn't get to, let's see. I just want to talk about the hotline really quickly. I do want to mention here, I didn't get to our hotline. I'd like for you guys to take out your phones right now and put this hotline number into your phone. This is the human trafficking hotline, 1-866-455-5075. We can connect victim service providers to resources around the state. We've got 289 resources. I run the hotline, that's how I know, around the state that offer services of all kinds. So here are the different services that we offer to victims of trafficking. So everything from crisis services to long-term survivorship needs, case management, legal services. We can connect victims to resources that are specific for their human trafficking needs, and we can report tips. And that's kind of where our work with Yolanda comes in. So I'm gonna pull up her slide deck here and let her take over.
Okay. So as mentioned before, I'm the hotline specialist for the state's Division of Child Welfare, and so wanted to just provide some additional information for you all about reporting suspected commercial sexual exploitation of minors. So I should give that. Yeah, okay. So of course, anyone can report concerns for child abuse and neglect, and we also have a 1-800 number, which is on one of the slides that you could, that's a good idea to take out your phone and program it in, so then you don't have to worry about it. And so anytime in which, you know, even somebody brings a concern to your attention, to be able to contact the state hotline and report that concern is really important. Just to also know, you have a handout that specifies who in the state of Colorado are considered mandatory reporters. So there's a list of folks, and I imagine most of you on the call likely fall under one of those professional obligations to report. And so I did just want to touch on the statute in Colorado that requires that. So if you, the bottom of the slide references the handout that you have available to you, which gives that list of mandatory reporters, as well as gives this statute from Colorado's law around that obligation to report. So it's really if you have the reasonable cause to know or suspect that you believe a child has been subjected to abuse or neglect, or that the circumstances are likely to create a situation in which the child will be abused or neglected. When that happens, when that suspicion happens, that's when you're obligated to report if you're one of those specified mandatory reporters. And you can do that one of three ways, either by calling your local law enforcement, which makes the most sense in situations where there's an emergency going on and you need a response within minutes. When that's the case, then you want to contact law enforcement because they have the ability to respond within minutes. So if you're seeing sort of a present danger situation, that's the most appropriate way to do that. You can also contact the county department, which is where the family lives. And so depending on where your county of practice is, if you're in Denver or Arapahoe County or Adams County, you can contact their direct Department of Human Services to report your concerns, or you can contact the state's hotline, which is the 1-844-CO4-KIDS. And hopefully you've seen some of the public awareness materials that have that number on, and billboards or on the side of buses, things like that. So if you are identified as one of those professional mandatory reporters, contacting one of those three agencies is what fulfills that requirement to report. And so the most direct part of this law is that when you have the suspicion, you make the report. The subjective part of the law is that what creates that suspicion, right? And so when we're talking about juvenile sex trafficking, that has been incorporated into the child abuse statutes in Colorado. So looking at the population of youth that are vulnerable to being trafficked or who have been survivors or victims of trafficking, that is now under the child abuse statutes. Labor trafficking is not yet under the child abuse statutes. You still could report concerns for that because there may be concerns that the family is not acting in a protective manner around trying to prevent that from occurring with labor trafficking. However, the commercial sexual exploitation of minors, that under 18 population, is part of the child abuse statutes. So that's what requires you to report if you were to suspect in any way that a youth is either been trafficked, or a child or a youth has been trafficked or is at risk of being trafficked. And so when we're looking at, I just wanted to touch back on the fact that you don't have to have the force, fraud, or coercion when it comes to the youth population or the child population. It's just that suspicion that likely they're, again, at risk or have been trafficked that would make you want to report. When you are making a report, one of the other handouts that you should have available to you is the Colorado Information Gathering handout, and that is a color-coded handout that is helpful to have reference to if you do have to make a report of suspected child abuse or neglect, including sex trafficking, because it will, the color coding is that anything in blue text are questions that call takers that are on the child abuse reporting hotline are supposed to ask you related to your concerns, and then the information in black text is additional screening information that they may try to obtain if that information is available or if you know that information. When you look at this Colorado Information Gathering Guide, please don't feel that you have to have answers to all of the questions in order to make your report. You absolutely don't. Whatever information you have is sufficient to report your suspicion. It's just to give you an idea that if the information is available to you or easily obtained by you, then to go ahead and prepare to report that information. And it's regarding various categories of abuse or neglect, because especially think youth or children who are being trafficked or at risk, there are usually other components to that contributing issues, like maybe a concern for supervision or a concern for a parent not providing adequate shelter, food, clothing, and therefore the youth feels that they might need to obtain that in some other manner, which makes them, again, vulnerable to exploitation. So when you're reporting, you want to provide as much information as you can in order to give us the best picture of not only what you're worried about, also what maybe strengths or protective factors exist in the family, who else may know about the situation in order to provide us additional information, and then just the general context of your concerns. You'll see here that that's where the 1844 Code for Kids number is, so please feel free to call that. It's a 24/7 number, so you can call that at any time with questions or to make a report of suspected child abuse or neglect. Sometimes people will ask me, can I be anonymous in reporting or confidential? And so the answer to that is that per our state laws, reporting child abuse or neglect to the child abuse hotline or to the county department, your information as the reporter is confidential. However, you also can choose to be anonymous if you want to. As a mandatory reporter, I would definitely encourage you to provide your information. It allows us to contact you back with additional questions or follow-up, as well as provide verification that you did make a report if it was ever called into question your obligation to make a report. If you do choose to remain anonymous, then I would recommend to you that you're documenting the date and time you called, who you spoke with, a report number if that's possible, so you'll have that for your records. Okay, so I think it's also kind of important not only to think about what type of questions you may be asked and hopefully have some of that information available if it is to you to provide to us. It's also good to know what additional screening questions we may ask about sex trafficking in particular, so your suspicion around that. And again, kind of like Kara said, it's not something that, generally speaking, somebody will come and say, I believe I'm a victim of sex trafficking. They will present with other questions or concerns, or maybe you'll observe other behaviors or issues that make you suspicious, yet, the language of sex trafficking isn't necessarily obvious. And so these are the type of questions that you could utilize to ask yourself, what do I have to be worried about in this situation, and also be prepared to answer to be asked of you if you were to call in a suspicion. So some examples that you'll see, and there's actually even more on the information gathering handout. However, I think one of the biggest learning curves for me in incorporating, as a child welfare worker for many years, was incorporating the idea of the vulnerability that is created for child sex trafficking when youth are engaged in what we would look at as high-risk behaviors. So an example of that would be, you know, I might have thought before, oh, this youth is truant from school, they're running away, you know, we can't keep them in a placement, or they don't, you know, they're running away from home, they're maybe experimenting with drugs, or just engaging in ways that I would think puts them at a high risk for their behavior, and didn't necessarily connect that to their vulnerability around sex trafficking exploitation. And realizing that especially homeless youth, especially LGBTQ identified youth, especially youth who experience those adverse childhood experiences or trauma or abuse or neglect within their home environment, how much that increases their vulnerability to trafficking. And really, what does trafficking look like, right? That no youth under the age of 18 can consent to commercial sex. And so that's been a big learning curve for me of reframing looking at youth as sort of beyond the control of their parent into looking at them as potential at-risk victims of exploitation and trafficking. So these kind of questions, we're trying to get at some of those behaviors to better identify whether the concern really is sex trafficking related or not. And so these questions might be asked. Oh, thank you. Okay, and so part of the reason that we have to figure out or drill down a little bit more if the concern is sex trafficking related for the child or youth you're reporting on is because county departments have a legal obligation to cross-report to law enforcement when there is suspected sex trafficking reported to them. So if someone were to contact the hotline and then we take those reports and pass them on to the county so that they can determine whether they're going to assess the situation further or not. If there is any suspicion of juvenile sex trafficking, then you'll see here on this slide, the county has the obligation to cross-report within 24 hours to local law enforcement. And we do that because, generally speaking, a response to sex trafficking has to be like a multi-pronged approach, and that there may be a criminal aspect to the situation, as well as for us on the child welfare side, a child protection issue that we need to look into further. And so when there is that suspicion of juvenile sex trafficking and the cross-report happens to law enforcement, then they themselves also have obligations of who they have to report to. And so for those of you that are child welfare workers, or for those of you that work directly with child welfare, like caseworkers, for example, when they're cross-reporting, then they're documenting that they cross-reported their suspicion to law enforcement, or your suspicion rather, to law enforcement as well. So if there's a criminal case that has to be pursued as a result, that can happen. Okay. Just for information, for those of you that aren't very familiar with child protection, when there's a report made to us regarding that suspicion or alleged abuse or neglect, again, including juvenile sex trafficking, then there are 3 things that have to occur for us to be able to intervene legally with a family on the child protection side of things. That's that the report contains a specific allegation of known or suspected abuse or neglect. Again, that does now include juvenile sex trafficking. That it provides sufficient information to locate the alleged victim child or youth, and it identifies a victim under the age of 18. So when those 3 criteria are present, then the Department of Human Services, the county department, can assign that report for assessment, and the caseworker assigned can then go and intervene with the family, which will mean interviewing the child or the youth, the parents, any collaterals that might have information about the concern that's being assessed further. And so they'll do that, and they actually have up to 60 days to do a full assessment and a short period of time in which to make initial contact with the family in order to determine what's the right level of services to provide, or how can we provide enough support to the family to keep the situation from worsening and future maltreatment. So sometimes people also have questions about how quickly a worker, once if I'm a mandatory reporter and I call in, how quickly will a county respond? If they do assign the report for further assessment, then they will either respond immediately if there's current or impending danger of moderate to severe harm. So that's why, though, I encouraged you all to contact law enforcement if the response is within minutes needed, because same day or immediate response for child welfare can be up to 8 hours. So it just is a little bit longer of a response possibly than law enforcement can provide. There's also 3 calendar day, which means there's impending danger. So maybe we're not worried about extreme danger at the moment. However, say a youth is in the hospital, so the safety of the youth is controlled for in that moment. However, within a few days, when the youth is released, we're worried about the environment they may go back into. So that would be a 3-day response, or the most common response is a 5 working day response. And so that's how quickly a worker has to get out to make face-to-face contact with the alleged victim child or youth. And then again, they have up to 60 days to do the full assessment, because they're trying to gather as much information to make an informed plan with the family to try to resolve the issues of concern that have been reported to us. So we definitely take a lot of calls on our child abuse reporting hotline. You'll see over 220,000 calls we took last year. About 100,000 of those result in reports of child maltreatment or for concerns of child maltreatment. And last year we were able to intervene with over 57,000 children and provide prevention services to almost 13,000 families. When a report that's made to us is not accepted for further assessment, then the family can be referred to prevention services, which often happens, which are voluntary services the family can engage in to try to address any concerns that there may be that aren't child abuse or neglect as defined in law. So I think that child welfare or child protection in particular, depending on your level of experience or engagement with child protection, it can be very scary for families. It can be difficult to report, because you are concerned about the well-being of a child, and it's not necessarily an easy process to have to go through to determine, yep, I suspect child abuse and neglect, now I need to call and make a report. I'm not sure what's going to happen after that fact. I hope everything for the youth or child works out. And so I definitely respect people's having to do that, because it's not an easy call to make necessarily, and it's absolutely a necessary one to try to protect the child from the situation that they may be experiencing or at risk of experiencing. And so we do our best in child welfare to engage with the family, to keep our work with the family centered on the well-being, safety, and permanency of children and youth. And so I think we have some time for questions, right?
Yeah.
We wanted to leave some time for questions.
I'm going to turn on our video. Are you ready?
Yeah.
So that we can answer questions in person. And I will also just quickly clarify, we just gave you the numbers for 2 different hotlines, and that can be a little bit confusing. So ours is a human trafficking hotline. It does not take care of your mandatory reporting requirement. Yeah. So our hotline is, I will say most of our calls are regarding adults who might not want to report, or they're coming from tips from the outside. So individuals who don't know that the people being trafficked, but see something that they think is maybe sketchy and want to report it. When someone does call about a youth, we are mandatory reporters as well, and I'll get in touch with Yolanda, or we'll call and make that call to the child abuse hotline as well. But you might call our hotline if maybe you don't suspect actual trafficking, but you're concerned about a child that may be being trafficked, or you want to seek resources in a community, right, in Durango, where we could maybe set up a mentor for that child or something like that. So that's when you might be able to utilize our services instead of calling the hotline. But generally, the 2 of us will work together if someone is reporting a crime having to do with sex trafficking of a minor, and we'll work together in that respect.
That's a good clarification.
Yeah.
Great. So a couple of comments have come in / questions. The first one is a comment about, please clarify for those new to the trafficking information that harboring is also considered just sheltering, not necessarily coercively or forcefully. For example, harboring a minor is a valid charge when a runaway is found at someone's home, not just if they are forced to be at that location.
I guess I feel like the person who asked the question kind of answered it, right? And yeah, I think that you just answered it, right?
Yeah, and if there was anything else you wanted to add to that specifically. But yeah, they just wanted to make sure to clarify that. And then we have another question. Am I being naive to think that the employers wouldn't be knowingly hiring these labor trafficking victims? I thought the ID requirements post 9/11 made it a lot harder to hire people under the table. Are employers just looking the other way? Are they in on it or profiting on the side?
Yes, employers are profiting. And you know, I don't want it to make it seem like everyone out there is trafficking someone, and not everyone who's undocumented is being trafficked, right? But there is a very large informal economy in Colorado, and yes, the employers are profiting off of the labor that they are not paying their trafficking victims for. Absolutely. You're not naive. It's just something that people don't believe could possibly be happening right under their noses, but in fact it really is. And I mean, I can give you example after example of local Colorado-owned businesses where this is happening, family-owned farms that are organic and were advertising on NPR where it was happening, and those farms no longer exist, for example.
Great, thank you. And then we have a hand that's raised, Lisbeth Camposano. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you wanted to ask your question or make your comment. So you're unmuted, Lisbeth, if you wanted to ask your question.
Oh, no, it was already answered. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. I'll go ahead and mute you again. Are there other questions? So those are the only questions that have come in so far. Folks might be typing in, or if you wanted to raise your hand and I can unmute you, or if you wanted to type in the question or comment that you have. So yeah, so we have a hand from Stacy Simmons. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you at this point. And if you wanted to ask your question, Stacy.
Hi, would you recommend approaching someone that you just wondered if it was a human trafficking situation? I'll just give you the example I'm thinking of. A few summers ago, this young woman came, she was in our neighborhood trying to sell magazines, and I was completely naive. I didn't really think too much of it. And my husband mentioned something that, oh, you know, this is something that happens with people that are being trafficked. And, you know, they go around, sell magazines, and then at night they either have to perform sex acts or whatever it is. And it has haunted me ever since. And if I ever see someone like that in my neighborhood again, would you recommend, you know, not maybe just going right up to them and asking, but kind of feeling out the situation and just maybe just coming out with it?
Yeah, I mean, I would be very cautious. It's highly likely that the trafficker is close by. Somebody's watching. But they may be around the corner or down the street. So be very careful for your own safety and the safety of the individual, right? Because if that trafficker sees that you're trying to interfere in some way, they may be punished as well. So being cognizant of all of that, if they were maybe at your door and you didn't see a trafficker in the line of sight, you might say, hey, you know, I knew somebody else that was in this situation and it didn't work out very well for them. Are you feeling safe where you're staying? Is there anything I can do for you? I wouldn't, you know, pull them into your home or say, hey, you must be a trafficking victim. Let me call that, right? So somewhere in between that, right? I always keep water and granola bars close by my door so that I can give that out, because generally they haven't had much to eat or drink in a long time. And I will give the hotline number to them. And I will just say, here's the human trafficking hotline. If you ever need help, these people are here to help 24/7. But I would scribble it down on a piece of paper so it looks like something ratty that they could put in their shoe maybe. Or I would, I would call the human trafficking hotline as soon as possible. If you get a license plate, even better. If
Okay.
you find out where that person is staying, usually they know what hotel they're staying at, and it's some kind of low budget hotel somewhere on the outskirts of the city, where, you know, 40 or 50 youth are staying. The law enforcement in Denver is well aware of how exploitative these groups are, and the calls will start rolling in this spring as the weather gets nicer. And we'll be out there looking. So if we get a call, we will alert our law enforcement officers, and they will get out there and look. I just don't try to, you know, don't try to save anybody. Just be aware of your own safety. But yeah, those small things might help.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Stacy, and thanks, Kara. We do have a couple more questions that just came in. So the first one is human trafficking only happening in Denver, primarily in Colorado, or are there other places where it is occurring in Colorado?
Yeah, it's really not just in Denver at all, actually. We see the most reported numbers in Denver, partially because of just the amount of resources that are out there. You've seen public awareness campaigns with billboards, more people are trained, and about 3.5 million people live in the greater Denver area, which is half of the state's population. So yes, there are more people, right? There's more instances of it happening, like per capita in Denver, but no, we've got many cases of trafficking in Colorado Springs, in Fort Collins, but even in Baca County, if you know where that is, in the southeast part of the state. We've got some cases. Garfield County has, on the western slope, that's where Glenwood Springs is, had some cases. We had several cases in Moffett County regarding the sheep herders that are raising our lamb out in the northwest part of the state. So no, it's definitely not just Denver. We see it in all of those industries that I mentioned: agriculture, ranching, construction, domestic servitude, within sex work, in meat packing plants. So yes, definitely all over the state.
Great, thank you. And then this other question is, are counties required to assess youth who are presenting with high-risk trafficking behaviors, or only those who are confirmed trafficked?
So there are certain, we have a screening tool for trafficking that we utilize, and there are certain like trigger points that tool is used. And so youth who run and come back from the run, that's one of the trigger points that child welfare staff are required to fill out that screening tool to assess for the risk and potential victimization. So it's kind of a both and answer to that. They have to assess those that are confirmed, and for sure, and then where it's suspected, they also are to assess that situation.
Perfect, thank you. And it doesn't look like any other questions are coming up. I don't have any other raised hands. Please feel free, again, to raise your hand if you do have a question, or type it in. In the meantime, Kara and Yolanda, are there other things that you want to leave folks with as we're wrapping up this particular webinar?
There's one thing that I didn't get to because I could just talk about this all day, but protocol development. Now, the child welfare departments have protocols developed, and they're going around the state and training child welfare state workers. However, the child welfare response to exploitation and the support system for youth around the state is more than just state workers, of course, right? It's nonprofits, it's child advocacy centers, it's child placement centers, it's foster families and foster homes, and much of the work that you're doing, the audience here. And so it's very important to get your staff trained, and also to develop protocols internally. So everyone knows, if I see these red flags, this is who I call, these are the numbers are accessible. I can't tell you how often I hear people saying, you know, I saw this thing and I didn't know who to call, so I just didn't really do anything about it. And, you know, it's not because they're heartless, it's because they're scared and they're afraid of making the wrong assessment. And so just knowing that you can call our hotline and just talk through a potential case that can be anonymous and talk it through with an expert is a great protocol to have in place. Knowing what resources are in your community, which we can connect you to as well through the hotline, is super, super important. So I really encourage folks to get trainings. For the rest of the staff that aren't here today, invite us in. We go all over the state doing these trainings, both Yolanda and I. and help us to help you establish protocols. Ask us questions, and I can send out tons of resources on what protocols should look like.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, because especially when we're talking about mandatory reporting, no one can force you to make a report and no one can keep you from making a report, right? So it's really about that individual suspicion around wanting to report. And I think, though, that's what's helpful within organizations or practice settings, is to know what the expectations are, especially for those practice settings where maybe there are some legally defined mandatory reporters and others who don't quite fit into those categories, to just make sure there's a consistent expectation and support, because again, it's not an easy thing to do, to worry about a youth or a child and then to have to make a report on the family. And so to be able to provide support for the workers in doing that, and also a consistent expectation around doing so.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. It doesn't look like we have any other questions that have come in, and we're also at the 1:30 mark. So if you do have any other questions that you weren't able to ask during this time, or something comes up as you're processing this webinar, in the follow-up email that I will be sending here shortly, you will have contact information on how to reach out and ask those questions. So any of those questions that aren't answered, you can again send those and follow up that way. Look out for that email. Please remember to fill out that survey. It's very helpful for us, very helpful for our presenters. And just thank you all for being here. We do have a webinar next week with Kara as well, that is going to focus on human trafficking in Colorado, particularly with adults. So Kara, is there anything you would like to say about that in terms of if folks are here today, what might be slightly different in the next session?
I haven't prepared it yet, specifically because I was hoping for feedback. So if you're going to be here next week, tell me exactly what you want to hear and I will tailor it to that response.
Perfect. Thanks, Karen. So again, that's May 15th from 12 to 1:30, same time. Again, keep an eye out for that email that I'll be sending here shortly. Thank you again to our presenters for their valuable time and information that they've shared with us. And thank you all again for attending the webinar. We hope to see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Video.